welcome to you all. Thank you for coming. I am Philip Rolnick, Professor of Theology and Chair of the Science and Theology Network, which sponsors public events on the interface of science and Christian theology. Tonight's event is to honor the career and the many, many academic and other contributions of Dr. Kenneth Kemp. Professor Kemp began his education studying language and linguistics at Georgetown and at the University of Texas. His education included summer study abroad in the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. That both countries fell apart some years after he returned home is, he insists, only a coincidence. However, the fact that he gave serious thought to summer study in a third country that no longer exists, Czechoslovakia, may leave that an open question in the mind of more objective inquirers. After receiving his master's degree in Slavic linguistics, he left university life for 4 years of active duty in the United States Army, where he served in the 18th Military Intelligence Battalion in Munich. When asked what exactly he did there, he will only say that his job was so secret that not even he knew what he was doing. His interests, meanwhile, shifted in the direction of philosophy and of the history of science. These he studied for a year in a master's program at St. John's College, and then for 4 years doing a doctorate at Notre Dame in the history and philosophy of science and philosophy itself. He then returned to active duty, this time in the U.S. Air Force, and taught philosophy for 4 years at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. After leaving active duty a second time with the rank of major, wonder if that's the highest rank at St. Thomas. No. He taught for a year at Texas A&M University. He came to St. Thomas in 1989 and is now completing his 30th and last year here. Over his years here, he has taught courses in logic, ethics, philosophical anthropology, ancient philosophy, the philosophy of law, and the history of and philosophy of science. His courses on science and religion received a grant from the Templeton Foundation. His work on historical linguistics, his undergraduate course of study, included Old Church Slavonic, Ancient Greek, Gothic, and Sanskrit. These have remained mostly a hobby for him. His study of languages that people still speak, he claims, has been more useful. He studied Russian and Serbo-Croatian as an undergraduate and learned Polish and Ukrainian while at St. Thomas. This led to a variety of programs for St. Thomas faculty and students in Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, and Lithuania, including taking some 200 students to Central Europe over the course of 10 J-term courses in theology, philosophy, and political science. He served as a Fulbright teaching fellow at the Catholic University of Lublin in Poland and also taught courses for local students in Ukraine and Kosovo. Together with a Polish graduate student, Professor Kemp translated several books from Polish into English, including the works of Archbishops Józef Życinski and Karol Wojtyła, otherwise known as Pope John Paul II. His dissertation and early research was focused on just war theory, and his publications on that topic appeared, among other places, in The Monist, in Public Affairs Quarterly, and in Theological Studies. They have been anthologized, which is an honor for an academic, in several collections of articles. Professor Kemp has also addressed questions in the history and philosophy of science, our main topic for tonight. This work called on other aspects of his linguistic ability, including the Latin and French, which he studied in school, the German, which he studied at university, and the Italian, which he just picked up along the way. His article on Adam and Eve, this article, I stress, it's especially important. In particular, has generated international interest. There are books, when people write now on the question of evolution and Adam and Eve, they typically cite Professor Kemp's seminal article published in the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly. This article was noticed by officials at the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. Yes, that's the old Inquisition. And no, according to Ken Kemp, it was not on suspicion of heresy. Just 2 weeks ago, partly because of that article, he received an invitation to give a lecture at Blackfriars, the Dominican establishment at Oxford University. He had hoped to, he is currently working on a book on Catholic evolutionism that should be finished this fall, and it will be delayed because Pope Francis recently announced that the Vatican archives of the Pontificate of Pius XII, that's from 1939 to 1958, have been opened, and so he'll be going to the Vatican to study these. Going back to the Vatican, I should say. Some of the results of this research on evolution in Catholic thought will form the subject of this evening's lecture, to which it is now time to turn. Would you join me in greeting and welcoming Professor Kenneth Kemp?
First, I wanted to double check this microphone to make sure that now that we've got a room full of people, it's still set. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay. So I've been thinking about the connection between science and religion, and in particular about evolution and creation now for over 40 years. Some of my colleagues asked me to share a few of my ideas with you tonight. And I picked out 3 topics to illustrate different aspects of my work. One, to illustrate philosophical analysis, another, historical research, and a third, thought about a substantive question at the interface between science and religion. Perhaps the lines separating those aspects are not too sharp. Perhaps the connections between the topics will not be too tight. Of course, I'll only be able to see a little bit about each of the topics I've chosen. Perhaps to follow up, some of you will want to take a look at some of what I've written. Or better, perhaps some of you will want to develop some thoughts of your own on some of these questions. So, first part, philosophical analysis, and in particular the conceptual distinction between evolution and creation. What can philosophical tools contribute to the thought about science and religion? The best way to begin an inquiry into the juxtaposition of evolution and creation is by undertaking a conceptual analysis of the juxtaposita. So, what is evolution? What is creation? Evolution, I want to suggest, should be seen as a pattern of scientific explanation. For too many people, the word evolution calls to mind the idea of a cosmic process, one and continuous from nebula to man, from star to soul, from atom to society, that I found in some 19th century attempt to characterize Darwin's contribution. But it's an idea that has appealed to some people. There have been, to be sure, thinkers who have advanced such a cosmic vision of the world. This was done in a materialistic way by a German biologist, Ernst Haeckel, and by English philosopher Herbert Spencer in the 19th century. It was done in a spiritualistic way by French Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin in the 20th. In developing their worldviews, however, Haeckel, Spencer, and Teilhard went far beyond drawing conclusions from scientific evidence. To the extent that an evolutionary history of the cosmos can be told as a scientific story, it's not so much a story of one continuous process as it is a composite of distinct but connectable theories. From the Big Bang through a somewhat Laplacian theory of the origin of the solar system and a somewhat Lyellian geology, to an as yet undeveloped account of the origin of life and a somewhat Darwinian account of the origin of species. each one a different theory, developed in a somewhat different way, connectable, but not in the sense of one continuous process. So, whatever the uses to which these theories might have been put by some, but by no means all of their supporters, they were not essentially an attack on Christian doctrine. Indeed, their foundations were laid partly by Catholics, René Descartes, Blessed Niels Stenson in geology, Father Georges Lemaitre in cosmology, partly by other Christians like Charles Lyell, again in geology, and partly by men who had lost their Christian faith for reasons unconnected to evolution, but who did not make anti-Christian polemics a feature of their work. So I have in mind Charles Darwin there. In order to see what makes these theories evolutionary, we need to distinguish several different kinds of scientific theory. We need to identify the variety of patterns which characterize various theories. So how do theories differ from one another? Some theories explain natural phenomena by positing laws, regularities in the behavior of familiar objects. A good example is Newtonian mechanics. The motion of billiard balls in collision, of iron balls dropped from towers or fired from cannons, of the moon and of the planets, are explained by positing three laws of motion and a law of universal gravitation. James Clerk Maxwell devised the same kind of law-based theory for electrodynamics. Other theories work differently. To understand why a watch keeps time, we don't want to know Newton's laws. We need to know in some detail the structure of the watch, from mainspring to escapement. An old-fashioned mechanical watch, of course, we can take apart at once. A second pattern of scientific theory succeeds by appeal to structure, sometimes even by positing a structure that we cannot see, but that has to be there in order for some natural phenomenon to work in the way it does. William Harvey's idea that blood circulates through the body required that blood somehow get from the arterial to the venous blood vessels. This led in turn to an argument for the existence of tiny connecting vessels, capillaries, years before those vessels were observed through Marcello Malpighi's microscope. At the beginning of the 19th century, John Dalton proposed the existence of chemical atoms that no one had ever seen and no one ever will be able to see in order to explain the various laws of chemical combination. Both of those theories, or both those kinds of theories, are synchronic. They explain initially puzzling natural phenomena by appeal to, or by the postulation of, laws or structures in light of which those phenomena cease to be puzzling. A third pattern of explanation is diachronic, historical. Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest cosmologist and one of the inventors of the Big Bang theory, characterized theories that fit this pattern as follows. They propose to seek out initial conditions which are ideally simple, from which the present world in all its complexity might have resulted through the natural interplay of known forces. The appeal to ancient causes makes it appropriate to call them paleo-etiological. They are found in many sciences, ranging from cosmology and historical geology to biology and historical linguistics. So, why do the languages of Romania and Portugal, of Italy and France, display such striking similarities and such systematic differences? The answer is that they're all descended with different modifications on the Danube and on the Tagus, on the Tiber and on the Seine, from a single known language, Latin, that was once spoken in all of these places, and of which we have extensive records. Why do Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and Gothic display such striking similarities and such systematic differences? At the end of the 18th century, Sir William Jones suggested an answer along the same lines, even though there's no direct evidence of a Proto-Indo-European language from which all those languages have descended. The fact that Old Church Slavonic, Modern Lithuanian, and when it was discovered Hittite could be added to that list only reinforced the plausibility of the hypothesis. It's a fruitful pattern. Descent with modification is the best explanation of a certain kind of diversity. Darwin proposed a formally similar explanation for the pattern of similarity and difference found in the flora and fauna of the earth. Why are there 250,000 different kinds of beetles? I'm sure you've asked yourself that question many times. And Darwin proposes an answer. Descent with modification from a proto-beetle. And this explains not only this pattern of similarity and diversity in flora and fauna, but much else in biogeography, in paleontology, and so on as well. I was tempted to put more slides in, but if I did, we could fill the whole hour with interesting examples. But what a point I want to make is that paleoetiological, including evolutionary theories, are different from the other kinds of theories because they explain not how natural substances work, but where they come from. The account of origins that they provide, however, is only an account of their proximate, not of their ultimate origins. They offer an account of the transformation of the world from a simpler or homogeneous state to a complex or heterogeneous one. They presuppose the existence of the world whose transformation they describe. To the details of the particular application of this pattern to the question of the origin of distinct biological species, I'll return shortly. But now I want to go in to the topic of creation. In its conceptual context, creation is a metaphysical account of the existence of the world. So where did that world itself, for the evolutionists, that initial simple state, come from? One possible answer to that question is that it was created. Sometimes the term creation is used rather too broadly, at least too broadly for my taste, to refer to any account of the origin of things, even to the extent of saying that materialists have their own creation story. This, I think, is not the way we Christians should use the term. We should carefully safeguard the names of our religious concepts. We should not use the term creation so broadly. Catholic theology includes 3 doctrines of creation, one concerning the material world, a second concerning the angels, and a third concerning man. To keep the exposition simple, I'll focus here on the Catholic doctrine of the origin of the material world. We'll talk about man more later. What is central to the doctrine is the idea that the material world as a whole depends on God for its very existence. We can formulate it as follows. Everything that exists outside of God was in its whole substance produced out of nothing. No creature can from its own power create something out of nothing. It'll follow from those two that God created the world. Next point, the world is a work of divine wisdom. Next, it was created for the glorification of God. Next, it had a beginning in time. Next, the world is a good world. These are at the core of the doctrine of creation. Connected to it, if that's not enough to flesh out your philosophy of God paper, we can talk about conservation. God conserves the world in being. He concurs with its actions. God created the world freely. There's lots of things to say about the doctrine of creation. About other questions, however, for example, how much the world we see around us looks like the world in the first moments after it was created by God, about how much it has changed over time, even about why there are 250,000 different kinds of beetles. The doctrine of creation and theology in general is silent. Scientifically, these are important questions. Theologically, given that they're not separately revealed by God, they're not. The doctrine of creation, as I've just characterized it, does real work. It's not inherently anti-evolutionist, but it is an explicit rejection of various alternative accounts of the origin of the world that have arisen over the course of the intellectual history of mankind. Here are a few. The world always existed. The world came into existence by emanation from God. The material world was created by an evil spirit. Or the world came into being spontaneously, out of nothing. Aristotle was an eternalist. Plotinus an emanationist. The ancient Persian religious thinker Mani gave us the creator demon. Some modern atheists, in their desperation, sound a lot like spontaneous ex-nihilationists. The doctrine of creation, in denying all of these alternatives, therefore did and does real work, even if it's silent about, say, the exact origin of starfish, or even of life, of bacterial flagella, or of blood clotting cascades. Contemporary anti-evolutionists, with the collusion of some of their anti-religious opponents, misappropriate the term creation when they call their anti-evolutionism creationism. In their overemphasis on design, they miss a distinction which they should make. Design does not prove creation. Plato's demiurge designed a world which he did not create. He worked on eternally existing matter. A creator does not, as a matter of conceptual necessity, design the world he created. We can imagine, counterfactually, but we can imagine God telling the angels to bring him some design plans for a material world, from which he'll choose the best and bring it into being. So design is one thing, creation is another. Worse, these same anti-evolutionists claim a contradiction that does not exist, one between evolution and creation. That was what I was trying to illustrate in what I said up until now. One of the 20th century's leading evolutionary biologists, Theodosius Dobzhansky, said it's wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive alternatives. I'm a creationist and an evolutionist. The grandeur of an evolutionary creationism was emphasized by Charles Kingsley in a letter which he wrote to Darwin shortly after the publication of The Origin, and by many others since then. I'm going to quote just two. One is Ludwig von Hammerstein, a Catholic priest in the 19th century, who wrote that a billiard player wishes to send 100 balls in particular directions. Which will require greater skill, he asks, to make 100 strokes and send each ball separately to its goal, or by hitting one ball to send all the 99 others in the directions which he has in view? And Jesuit entomologist, also at the beginning of the 20th century, Erich Wassmann, wrote, God's power and wisdom are shown forth much more clearly by bringing about these extremely various morphological and biological conditions through the natural causes of evolution than they would be by a direct creation of the various systematic species. So that was them. I say everyone who accepts the first of the theses articulated above, that C1 and C2, about bringing the world into being out of nothing, and so all Christians are entitled to the designation creationist. Evolutionists who accept those ideas are no less creationists than are anti-evolutionists. That, in brief, shows what philosophical analysis can contribute to our understanding of the issue at hand. Now I want to turn to a second kind of work that I've done, historical research on Catholicism and evolution. As many of you know, I've put some years into writing a history of Catholic evolutionism, not quite finished yet. Catholic evolutionism began early. The honorary title of founder of Catholic evolutionism might be given to Belgian geologist Jean-Baptiste de Maillet-Dallois, or to English anatomist St. George Jackson Mivert, though surely Italian zoologist Filippo de Filippi should also be mentioned. In illustration of what this part of my work has included, I want to do four things. To sketch the historical context of the Catholic reception of evolutionary biology, to say something about what's distinctive about that reception, to say a few words about where the controversies did and did not lie, and finally to tell briefly the story of one particular Catholic evolutionist, a story which I've chosen precisely because it's local. So, the historical context of the Catholic reception of evolutionary biology. It's important to keep in mind, as one studies the Catholic reception, the extent to which the Church was a particular target of the anti-religious polemicists of the 19th century. So here's Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog. He once referred to our great antagonist, I speak as a man of science, the Roman Catholic Church, the one great spiritual organization which is able to resist and must, as a matter of life and death, resist the progress of science and modern civilization. He added, the Catholic priest is trained to know his business and do it effectually. The professors of Maynooth, was one of the leading seminaries in Ireland, learned, zealous, and determined men permitted me to speak frankly with them. We talked like outposts of opposed armies during a truce, as friendly enemies. The religion that contended with science in John W. Draper's seminal History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, published in 1875, the reader quickly learns is not religion in general, but Catholicism. More generally, the Catholic response to evolutionary biology, it's helpful to keep in mind, had to be worked out in the same time as the Church fended off the attacks of an aggressively anti-clerical, when not explicitly anti-religious liberalism. So the Kulturkampf in Germany, and we'll show you the cartoon between Berlin and Rome. Maybe you can recognize Bismarck on one end and Pius IX on the other. And the box you can see there that contains pious bishops, it says imprisoned, because he did imprison some of the Catholic bishops in Prussia and in the German Empire. And in Italy, the Risorgimento. Here is Garibaldi. What's his good offer? He says to Pius IX, take this cap, Papa Pius, the Liberty cap. You'll find it more comfortable than your own. So this is the context in which the battle over evolution was fought, or the reception, the question of the reception of evolution was raised. There are counterparts to this in France and Spain and Latin America. Let me read just a little bit from Harry W. Paul, an historian, about the situation in France. He said there was a clear attempt to base anti-clerical Republican politics on a scientistic ideology. Darwinism was most susceptible to exploitation by anti-clericals. The intellectual problem of reconciling religious beliefs with new scientific developments was thus connected with Republican anti-clericalism. This meant that Republicans were encouraged to accept Darwinism, and that Catholics had a good political reason to be suspicious of it as an ideological weapon against Catholicism. Only the finest minds were capable of separating the purely scientific aspects of Darwinism from the wider social and political implications. That's Harry Paul. The extent of that hostility is revealed in a comment which Jesuit entomologist Erich Wassmann called from the many press comments about some public lectures he delivered in Berlin in 1907. A Protestant critic wrote to the Harz Courier, I should prefer somewhat less ecclesiastical indignation from Father Wassmann's critics and somewhat more scientific truth. If scientific truth prevailed, the awkward situation would not arise that in a Protestant country a sense of honor compels a third person to come to the assistance of a Jesuit. Wassmann was writing, one might add, from his Dutch exile. The Jesuiten gazettes, which had expelled the Jesuits from Germany in 1872, still being in force. The Catholic Church was not the sole object of such attacks. Still, there are some distinctive features of the Catholic encounter with evolutionism. So what's different? There are several reasons why the Catholic reception is different from that of various Protestant churches. First, Catholicism is distinctly conservative in its theology, but not literalistic in its hermeneutics. That is to say, first, it has always acknowledged the place of allegorical interpretation in reading the Bible, though the allegorical sense of a passage was supplementary to, not alternative to, the literal sense. Second, it's always been more open to metaphorical interpretation than are some of today's Protestant literalists. It's important to note that in the Catholic tradition, metaphorical interpretations are considered to be part of the literal sense, as the Church has traditionally used that term. Finally, in the last years of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, the Church came gradually to accept the use of historical, critical, and other scientific methods. Unlike some branches of conservative Protestantism, it has never been committed to the kind of plain meaning hermeneutics that made literacy and piety, of course, a sufficient preparation for scriptural interpretation. Some Protestants worry that to interpret the Hexameron as anything but an account of 6 literal days is to step onto a slippery slope. So Tennessee Judge John T. Ralston, who presided over the Scopes trial in 1925, later said, if I listen to evolution and lose my faith in Genesis, I'm afraid I'll lose my faith in the rest of the Bible. And if I want to commit larceny, I'll say I don't believe in the part of the Bible that says thou shalt not steal. Catholics, of course, rely on the magisterium, the teaching authority of the Church, to distinguish between passages that are not to be interpreted metaphorically, such as unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink my blood, you will have no life in you, and those that may, such as on the seventh day God finished the work which he had done. So, second difference, 19th century Catholic thought differed from the debate within Protestantism as a result of Catholicism's 19th century revival of Thomistic philosophy. The commitment of Pope Leo XIII to make that philosophy a prominent feature of Catholic intellectual and educational life affected the reception of evolutionary accounts of the origin of species in several ways. Most importantly, it offered a philosophical defense of the exceptionalist anthropology that was central to Catholic theological anthropology. That is, the idea that man and animal were different in kind. That was an idea that had been explicitly rejected by Darwin in The Descent of Man, a rejection which was the grounds for, not, it's important to note, a consequence of, his evolutionary account of anthropogenesis. In addition, Thomistic anthropology embedded its account of human nature in a larger philosophy of nature, a holomorphism that was both essentialist and teleological. Thus, in addition to the question, important to all Christians, of whether Darwinism or other theories of biological evolution deny the existence of souls or just ignore them, Catholic intellectuals faced two further questions. The first was that of how the Darwinian concept of species related to the concept of biological species used in St. Thomas' essentialist philosophy. The second was whether natural selection in the judgment of some non-teleological process is compatible with a general teleological or goal-directed philosophy of nature. Finally, the story of Catholic evolutionism, as one might expect, is affected by two features of the Church. It's centralized, the Church is centralized in the sense that decisions made in Rome had an effect throughout the Catholic world. So I've had to spend weeks at the Vatican in the archives of the Holy Office and of the Society of Jesus and in the secret archives, the place which journalists in their silly days like to include on lists of 13 places on the planet off limits to visitors. That was from the BBC, I think, or The Guardian, someplace like that. But it's not really so. It's also an international story. To tell it required that I look at thought of scientists from England, Germany, Italy, and France, at the writing of priests and bishops from Hungary, the United States, and El Salvador, and encyclopedias published in Poland, Spain, and the United States. So, where do the controversies lie? Evolutionary biology includes a number of distinct ideas, some more and some less central to the theory, and some with better scientific support than others. We need to distinguish four. So listed here first, the general idea of transformism, that is, a biological species originate by descent with modification from earlier species. Second, natural selection, the idea that that modification is effected by random mutations and non-random reproduction. Third, common ancestry, that all species have descended from one or a few first kinds. And fourth, the rejection of human exceptionalism, that is, the idea that human beings do not differ in kind from other animals. That's the rejection of exceptionalism. So the Darwinists say they do not differ in kind. So human beings originated from a non-human species by the same natural processes that give rise to other species. Catholic thinking about these ideas did not accept or reject evolution as a whole, but evaluated each of the above theses separately. The first three were generally, if not universally, recognized as not having a significant theological dimension. As a review of the various Catholic encyclopedias published since the rise of Darwinism shows. The second edition of Herder's Konversationslexikon, published in Germany in 1877, and a few manualists, writers of textbooks, dissented, but more typical was the view in the first edition of the Dictionnaire apologetique de la foi catholique in France in 1889. The Bible grants equal freedom to transform us and to the defenders of successive creations, the author said. Whenever it is not absolutely explicit, anyone who invokes its authority puts at risk both the Bible itself and the religious cause of which it is the support. It seems to me that encyclopedias can be revealing here, because there we're getting something that somebody intends to publish and disseminate widely to libraries who are going to have the money to afford it, and so on. And so it seems to me to be some indication of where the consensus or where the range of ordinary opinion lies. The fourth thesis is a rejection of human exceptionalism. That was different. That is, the first three were not generally seen as theologically significant, but the fourth one was. All Catholics who addressed the question were exceptionalists. Where did that leave the origin of the first human beings? And there was a strong creation, or a strong consensus among Catholics, though not at Vatican I, quite a willingness to declare it as a matter of faith that each individual human soul, that means not just Adam's and Eve, but yours and mine, that each individual human soul was directly created by God. If that was true of every human soul, then it was also true of the first. Some Catholic evolutionists held that that alone was sufficient to constitute the distinctive creation of man, which was declared by the Pontifical Biblical Commission in 1909 to be one of the points that Catholics should not call into doubt. But what about the origin of the first human body? One of the earliest proponents of a Catholic evolutionism, English biologist St. George Mivart, laid out in his book on the Genesis of Species, published in 1870, so almost the same year as the Descent of Man of Darwin, the idea that the first human body was a product of evolutionary processes. But the first human being came into existence only when God created and infused into that evolved body a human, a rational, immortal soul. Eminent Spanish Thomas Ceferino Cardinal Gonzalez, in his La Biblia y la Ciencia, published in 1891, pointed out that the inclusion of evolutionary processes in the formation of the first human body did not necessarily exclude direct divine action. Perhaps God formed the first human body not out of dust, but rather by modifying an animal body in such a way as to make it suitable for the infusion of a rational soul. For a long time, many Catholics, including many in high places, rejected Mivart's view, and Gonzalez. Some, and that is in Gonzalez's view, some on biblical grounds that the Vulgate said that God formed the body of Adam ex limo terrae, from the slime of the earth. Others, on what might be called aesthetic grounds, thought it unseemly to think of Adam as having simian parents. The latter concern received an early reply from De Filippi, who in the 1864 lecture on Man and Apes that launched the debate over Darwinism in Italy said, "No one objects to saying that man is the ultimate terminus of the chain of created beings. But when one counts and names the links in that chain, protests arise from every quarter. To think that the origin of man is perhaps less divine when the biblical clod of earth turns out to be the entire organic world is a strange way of understanding human dignity." So now I want to move away from the big picture view of Catholic reception to St. Paul, Minnesota. Tell a particular story of a Catholic evolutionist here at St. Thomas. There's hardly time to tell every story I'd like to tell, but I think you get the flavor of particulars from this one. So I've chosen as my subject a priest who taught at our own institution, Father John Gmeiner, who died in 1913. Gmeiner was born at Bernau in the Kingdom of Bavaria in 1847, but he was brought by his parents to the United States when he was 2. He entered St. Francis de Sales Seminary in Milwaukee in 1859 and was ordained a priest in 1870. Gmeiner was not perhaps a good fit for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, one of the anchors of the German Triangle at the heart of the American Catholic Midwest. Its Archbishop, John Martin Henney, ruled his diocese by the principle listed at the top of the screen, Die Sprache rettet den Glauben. Translated, that would be the language saves the faith, though if he'd had his way, many of you wouldn't need a translation. Gmeiner, by contrast, took the assimilationist side in the bitter late 19th century fight between German and Irish American Catholics over the relation between culture and religion. Here's Gmeiner. The Catholic Church is no literary club nor any ethnological society, but a divinely instituted organization to bring men of all nations to eternal salvation. And as if that were not offensive enough to fromme Ohren, to pious German ears, he went on to write, "Let our German infidels who ignore the one true God worship their idol Deutschtum. For us Catholics, our German language is not an object of religious veneration." In 1887, he managed to secure a transfer to more friendly territory on the western side of the St. Croix River, where, Under the protection of Archbishop John Ireland, he continued his assault on German-American Catholicism in a booklet entitled The Church and Foreignism, the stridency of which very nearly resulted in its being placed on the index of prohibited books. You can see that, what he's complaining about. The European Catholics and their American allies like Gmeiner and Heiss in Milwaukee are on the verge of destroying as far as possible our national identity by making, for instance, of Wisconsin a German province. And so this was not to the taste of German Catholics, and they complained to Rome. He taught for several years at St. Francis Seminary in Milwaukee, so it was only natural that his first assignment in his new diocese was at what was then called St. Thomas Aquinas Seminary. He had broad intellectual interests. There's his CV, his publications, but I'm not going to read it all through. Joseph Connors called him a fluent and incisive writer, widely read, keenly interested in contemporary issues, progressive in his views. His topics varied widely, as you can see, from apologetics to the American Catholic Church, to world religions, to science and religion. Gmeiner had been interested in that last topic since about the time of his ordination. He addressed the question of evolutionary biology in 3 of his published works, the ones in red. In Modern Scientific Views and Christian Doctrine Defended in 1884, which appeared while he was still teaching at St. Francis Seminary, he defended 4 theses. First, Darwin's natural selection and common ancestry theses are compatible with Scripture, a point that had already been made by Franz von Hummelauer in his Biblische Schöpfungsbericht in 1877. Since these theses were anticipated by St. Augustine, who had written in his commentary on Genesis, De Genesi ad Litteram, that all things were created potentially and causally in the first creation of matter. Third, Darwin's ideas on these points are no more than a bold hypothesis. And fourth, about the origin of the first human body, he said, "I'd not venture to declare Professor Mivert's opinion that is evolution of the body and infusion of the created soul inconsistent with any Christian doctrine, although great theological authorities decidedly reject the same." In his second paper on Herbert Spencer's comprehensive evolutionism, which he delivered to the first Congrès Scientifique International des Catholiques in Paris, shortly after his transfer to St. Thomas, Gmeiner argued that Spencer's work contained grave errors, though not on every point. In Medieval and Modern Cosmology in 1893, his last comment on the topic, he seems to be more positively disposed to the theory of evolution, both in general and with respect to the human body, without going so far as to make an explicit endorsement. Gmeiner did not make major new contributions to Catholic evolutionism. He was not a scientist, as were Mivert and De Filippi. He was not an exegete, as was von Hummelauer. He was a popularizer. Nevertheless, his work shows that Catholic evolutionism was not the opinion only of a few maverick Catholic scientists in London or Turin or Louvain. Openness to the evolutionary origin of the human body could be found among Catholic intellectuals in San Salvador, another case I discussed comes from there, and in St. Paul. So, last thing I want to do, address a particular question. That's monogenesis, or the question of Adam and Eve. Much of the early Catholic debate over evolutionary anthropogenesis was, as I said earlier, focused on the origin of the first human body. But it included consideration of another logically distinct question as well. That was a question of whether the human race began with a single couple, or in other words, the question of monogenesis. The alternatives were to say that the human race originated from initial population, that is, polygenism, or even from a number of different initial populations, polyphyletism. So, take a minute to look at those terms, because I'll use them again over the next few minutes. The traditional theological count of a human race originating in a single couple was based not merely on the early chapters of Genesis and not merely as a foundation for the doctrine of the unity of the human race, but for reasons connected to the doctrine of original sin. The Locus Classicus of St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, where he wrote, "Therefore, as sin came into the world through one man and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all men sinned." The Council of Trent expressed the doctrine in this way: the sin of Adam is in its origin one, and being transfused into all by propagation, not by imitation, is in all men and proper to each. Now, the implications of that are as follows. If one in origin means committed as one act, and by propagation means through biological descent, and man's origins were polygenetic in either form, that is, a whole group of first individuals, then it would follow that Adam's contemporaries, and perhaps some of their descendants, would have been made free from original sin because they weren't descended from the original sinner. Since a denial of P4 is clearly intended by the Council of Trent, one of the first three propositions must be false. That's the one that's set together implies 4, false, false. So one of the set of P1 through 3 must be false. P1 and P2 have always seemed to be exactly what Trent was asserting. That leaves P3 is the one that has to be rejected as incompatible with the doctrine of original sin. This view would probably have been defined by the First Vatican Council had the Italian capture of the city of Rome not led to the suspension of the council. It was emphasized by Pope Pius XII in his 1950 encyclical Humani Generis. The early 19th century had seen the emergence of scientific claims that the racial variation among human beings required distinct origins for distinct races of people, so a clear polyphyletism. This view was defended by such important 19th century scientists as Louis Agassiz and Alexander Winchell. It's distinct from the questions of evolution, a theory which Agassiz rejected but Winchell accepted. Darwin's theory, by contrast, was monophyletic. It included the idea of what he called single centers of creation. Well, that is that all the individuals of the same species, wherever located at present, have descended from the same parents. That monophyletism was consistent with the traditional Catholic doctrine. I mean, as far as I've articulated it. Catholic reviewers of Darwin's Origin of Species expressed some amusement at the fact that scientists who only a few years before had had difficulty with the idea of a common ancestry for the Chippewa, Hottentot, Chinese, and English, now propose that those same Chippewa and Englishmen shared common ancestry with plants and animals. Now, to be clear, Darwin tries to avoid directly the question of descent of man in the Origin of Species, but everybody saw where it was going, and that quickly became, everybody thought, the implication. So, but anyway, Darwin had said parents, however, in the plural. Right, all individuals are descended from the same parents. His theory was, though monophyletic, also polygenetic, and thus was inconsistent with traditional Catholic doctrine on that point. The same view was defended early in his career by Teilhard de Chardin, until his superiors forbade him to write on the issue. The case for polygenism was recently reinforced by genetic evidence. Francisco Ayala defended it not on the basis of general evolutionary principles, but on the basis of some particular facts about human genetics, which rule out an original couple in human phylogenetic history. Maybe I should have said not human genetics, but human genes. It's not about processes, but what particular genes we find there. He pointed out that one of the genes that make up the human leukocyte antigen complex has 59 variants, 32 of which are also found in similar, though not identical, form in chimpanzees. The best explanation of that similarity is that these variants arose early, that is, before the phylogenetic divergence of chimpanzee and man, some 6 million years ago. Since no individual can carry more than 2 such variants, the absolute minimum human population in every generation after the evolution of man from the last human chimpanzee ancestor is 16. Ayala calculated that the minimum bottleneck sufficient to maintain the level of diversity which is observed to exist is about 4,000 synchronously reproducing individuals. That suggests an actual population minimum of some 15 to 20,000 individuals. Ayala's work has not won universal acceptance, but other estimates of the size of the bottleneck based on other data fall into the same range. Harvard paleontologist and historian of science, Stephen Jay Gould, in an essay he called No Overlapping Magisteria, argued that science and religion are independent, each constituting a domain where one form of teaching holds the appropriate tools for discourse and resolution. These two magisteria, he continued, have equal status but separate subject matters. If pursued properly, they cannot conflict. Monogenesis is, in my judgment, just one topic that shows that Gould is wrong about this. As my third topic of this evening's talk, then, I want to say a few words about my own attempt to resolve this apparent contradiction between a particular conclusion of the biological sciences and a particular theological doctrine. On the quantitative aspect of the question of the origin of the human race, how many of us were there appears to be a conflict between scientific theory and theological doctrine. What should we do? An old scholastic adage says, when faced with a contradiction, make a distinction. So the distinction I proposed some years ago distinguishes three senses of the term species. First, the biological human species, a population of interbreeding organisms. This is a standard biological definition of the concept of species. They can have offspring, continue to another generation. The idea that this species concept has to be distinguished from a more philosophical conception of species had been defended by Catholic evolutionists such as Jesuit entomologist Eric Bosman, at least since the beginning of the 20th century. The philosophically human species is the rational animal. That is, a natural kind characterized by the capacity for conceptual thought, judgment, reasoning, and free choice. St. Thomas argued that a certain kind of body is necessary for rational activity, but it's not sufficient for it. Rational activity requires, in addition, the presence of a rational soul, something that is more than the power of any bodily organ, and that therefore can only come into being in each individual case through a creative act of God. Now, third conception of species. Theologically, human species is extensionally the collection of individuals that have an eternal destiny. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says God created man in his image and established him in his friendship. Human rationality is probably a necessary prerequisite to such friendship. It's not clear, however, that the offer of such friendship is a logical consequence of rationality. Presumably, the offer, an offer which in itself makes a species theologically distinct, is a separate free act of God, perhaps required by his goodness, but not in any stronger sense necessary. In any case, the two human attributes, rationality and eternal destiny, are at least conceptually distinct from one another. The distinction between that first conception of human species and the other two makes possible an origin of the human race that is polygenetic with respect to the biological species and monogenetic with respect to the philosophical and theological species. To show that it's possible, all I need to do is tell a consistent story, that is, to have both the genetic evidence and the theological doctrine. So here's my story. Evolutionary processes produce a population of about 5,000 hominids, beings which are in many respects like human beings, but which lack the capacity for intellectual thought. Out of this population, God selected two and transformed them by creating and infusing into them rational souls. Only beings with rational souls are truly human. The first two theologically human beings misuse their free will, however, by choosing to commit the original sin, thereby losing the preternatural gifts that God had also given them, though not the offer of divine friendship, by virtue of which they remain theologically and not just philosophically distinct from their merely biologically human descendants and their merely biologically human ancestors and cousins. These first true human beings also have descendants which continue to some extent to interbreed with the non-intellectual hominids among whom they live. If God endows each individual that has even a single human ancestor with an intellect of its own, a reasonable rate of reproductive success, and a reasonable selective advantage would easily replace a non-intellectual hominid population of 5,000 individuals with a philosophically, and if the two concepts are extensionally equivalent, theologically human population within a few centuries. Throughout this process, all theologically human beings would be descended from a single original couple, in the sense of having that human couple among their ancestors, without there ever having been a population bottleneck of two individuals that constituted the entire human species. The scenario then accommodates both the genetic evidence and the theological doctrine of monogenesis, because it does two things. First, it distinguishes between true, that is, intellectual human beings and their genetically human-like but non-intellectual relatives. Second, it recognizes that the theological doctrine of monogenesis requires only that all human beings have the original couple among their ancestors, not that they be descended exclusively from that single original couple. They and we can also have even the several thousand hominid ancestors which Ayala says that the genetic evidence requires. This theory is monogenetic with respect to the theologically human species, but polygenetic with respect to the biological species. Thus, the distinction resolves the contradiction. Well, that took about all the time that was reasonable for me to take, so I'll conclude there. It's a sample of what I've been doing these past many years. Hope it's been of interest. Thanks for coming.
Well, folks, you have cards. I think you have pencils. Please write your questions, and and if people from the Science and Theology Network could go up and down the aisles and collect them, pass them to the center, or to the end, whatever's closest, and we'll have people coming up and down to collect your questions. So if you have a question written, we'll bring it up for Professor Kemp.
Can I just come down? Can I do it from here?
Yeah, you could. And here.
From down low? Okay.
Here's the first question.
Okay.
Okay, discuss the bottleneck. Okay, our first question is requesting that Professor Kemp discuss the bottleneck. What is the bottleneck?
Oh, okay. So the idea of the bottleneck is that the population goes through a very small number of people. So you had a population of 5,000, and all of a sudden it collapsed down to 2, and so that everybody after that was descended from the first 2. That was what I had in mind by a bottleneck. That is what Ayala says is you can't have such a small initial population, that there are too many different genes to get through so few people. There's got to be a larger population in order that the genes that we see in the chimpanzees continue on to the human population. So that was the bottleneck.
Okay, here's one. Questions at the bottom.
Okay. Would the story mean that there were walking biological human beings that we couldn't interact with? Well, I suppose it depends on what you mean by interact with. We couldn't have great conversations with them, I suppose, but we could interact with them in other ways. They'd be more like pets. I mean, in a certain way. That is, we interact with our pets? Well, sure, but, the dog liked to take a walk with me, but if I wanted to, give the dog my latest insights on this stuff, well, the dog just looked at me. And, so there'd be a certain kind of interaction, but not others. Were Neanderthals, with whom we share some of our DNA, were the theological humans or only biological? And that's a hard question then to decide how exactly we read this story back onto the evidence that we have of early human beings or human-like beings. And I don't have an easy answer for it. I wish I I did, I at least have a start on how to think about it. I mean, I think the key has got to be has got to be rationality. That is, human beings are rational. Surely that's what makes us, in this important respect, different from animals. Now, are animals rational? On this view, the answer would be no, but we have to be careful what we mean by rational. I mean, Darwin in The Descent of Man is able to tell lots of stories, and we can tell others about clever things that animals do. And of course, in recent years, ethologists, students of animal behavior, have found more interesting things. And we give a concrete example. There was a case a few years ago where scientists were testing New Caledonian crows. These crows are known to make a certain kind of tool in the wild. They take leaves and trim them down so they can get all the insects they so like to eat out of crevices where insects hide. So the scientists were interested in seeing what else the crows could do. We knew they could make tools. Could they pick the right tool? So they made a test by putting baskets full of tasty grubs into a jar, which in a little basket in the jar, which the crow could get only by picking up a hook and pulling the basket out of the jar, and then they got the grubs. So they made some hooks. Well, they taught the crows to do this, made some hooks, left them lying around, and then released a couple of crows into the test area to see whether they'd pick the hook up or a straight wire that was also lying around. Now, why they left free two crows isn't entirely clear, but they did. One male, one female. The male crow grabbed the hook and flew off to the corner of the room. So when the female crow showed up, all she found was a straight wire, which wasn't good enough for pulling the basket out. That crow bent the wire into a hook and got the stuff out. Now, crows do not have wire in nature. They don't bend things. This shows, of course, real cleverness. You might, by extension, call that rationality. Darwin does. When he says rationality, he just means skill at problem solving and at responding sensibly to the environment. But Aristotelians have always meant by rationality something much narrower, that is actually having concepts, not just images, actually being able to make judgments and make reasoning, draw conclusions on the basis of those. So to give you the idea of a concept, there was something in the news the other day. There were some gorillas that had been orphaned by poachers, and they'd been taken into some kind of home for orphaned gorillas. And the picture where the gorilla was standing up like human beings do, and so that kind of amused everybody. And the manager at this facility said, well, they think of their keepers in the zoo kind of like their father. Now, I don't want to be hard on the zookeeper. It's hard to say this any other way. But we might say, look, it's not that they have the concept of father, which they can say, that's my father, your father's over there and stuff. I mean, they have some kind of relation to the keeper, but not the concept of father. So that's what's really different in human beings contrasting to animals. And then comes the hard question, well, what about the Neanderthals? Do they have concepts or not? So we'll go ask them. Well, they're not around anymore. So we can look at what they produce and ask, does it take an intellect, reasoning power to do this or not? And it's a hard question. It's a good one. I wish I had the answer, but that's how to think about it, I think.
Here's another hard question.
Oh, share any thoughts about the fact that death is central to evolution as a means of selection, but Scripture sees death as enemy? Yeah, I think I can. At least I have an idea. You can see whether it's a good one. Anyways, the thought is mine. My idea is that...
repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe I'll just read it then. Can you share any thoughts on the fact that death is central to evolution as a means of selection, but Scripture sees death as the enemy, starting with sin and not foundational to God's creation? I think that conception of God applies distinctively to human beings. And what it means is separation of body and soul. That is, that death is a separation of the body and the soul, each continuing to exist separately for a while until the body decays. But I mean, that this is what was not intended by God. God intended, this is my guess, my attempt to make sense of the passage you mentioned, that God intended that at the end of our earthly life we would ascend body and soul into heaven, like Our Lady did. Or if you don't like the doctrine of the Assumption, maybe like Enoch did, or Elijah, but maybe. But anyway, that was the idea. And that because of our sin, this body and soul had to be pulled apart and put together. Of course, in trivial ways, natural selection does continue to affect human beings, but not in the really important ways. I mean, really important ways are taken over by culture. So anyway, that's my thought, is that is focused on human beings, separation of body and soul, not on the death of plants or animals.
Okay, read this one too, please.
Could the one act of original sin have been jointly performed by the whole population of 5,000 philosophical human beings? Would that solve the problem? Some people have talked as though it would. Now, I suppose in the day of Twitter, it's easy to imagine 5,000 human beings cooperating in some misdeed. But it's a little harder to imagine 5,000 cavemen cooperating in the same act. And so I think the problem with 5,000 all committing a sin, even if there are no theological problems other than that, I have a hard time imagining it. That's my thought.
Here's a new one.
Oh, I'll put them over here. What are the moral implications of interbreeding with the individual without a soul? They're wrong. And one of my colleagues, that is, it would be bad to do this. One of my colleagues, he's now retired, objected to this. This is horrible. How could I say such terrible things about our ancestors? See, what terrible things? That they're sinners? I said, I read that, and what's that book, Genesis? It's all over the place, right? I mean, there's the original sin, then there's Cain and Abel, then there's, the whole, everybody misbehaves and so on. It's clear that our ancestors were sinners. So I'm not making any novel claim there. But this sin, you say? Well, I mean, you got to understand what this sin is. I think it's we have to talk about it. Misconception to imagine it as bestiality. I mean, it's productive, for example. They look like us and so on. It's still a sin. It's impersonal sex. Such that nobody had ever permitted or nobody had ever performed. Well, I wish. But that's the problem of our own day, is a lot of impersonal sex going on. So is it bad? Yeah, it's bad. They shouldn't have done it. Is it worse than what people do now? No, it's the same. How would you square Thomistic essentialism, seemingly a necessary preamble for much Catholic theology, with a seeming lack of sufficiently stable biological types and species, which seem to indicate no essences among living organisms? Yeah, I think this is a serious problem, and I can't give as developed an answer as I'd like. This is some of what comes up in the question of how to understand species in St. Thomas compared and contrasted with the term species as it's used among evolutionary biologists. But a couple things I think we might say. I mean, one, there is still a stability in evolutionary biology. It's not, I don't know whether he said radical instability, but there's some stability. I mean, organisms do still have offspring that are mostly like themselves. Now, sometimes they're different, but why? Well, in a certain way, external reasons, because the thing gets blasted by X-rays or cosmic rays or something like that. So if you get a different, if you do that to a species, you may end up with gametes that are different from the way that the parent cells were, and it gives rise to a new species. So I agree that there's more to be said, and I don't know fully what to say about it. Beyond that, I'd say what's most important about the Thomistic philosophy is, of course, the stuff about human beings. And the existence of a rational soul makes the human beings different in species from all of the hominid ancestors. And so even if you don't get the squirrels separate, or even if you don't get the the mammals separate from the cephalopods and so on. I think there's something deeper there that's sufficient to do what the theology needs. Where does the Sabbath and God's rest come into existence in a long evolutionary process? God declares it.
Could you reread?
I'm sorry?
That?
Oh,
reread that, please.
Where does the Sabbath, God's rest, come into existence in a long evolutionary process? I think it's something that's declared by God for the good of human beings. And so I think such things can be done on the basis of a story. They don't have to be done on the basis of a literal truth. I mean, you might, of course, if you want to be too literal, you might start asking questions like, God rested? Why did he need to rest? Was he tired? Is that really the way we want to talk about God? And we say, no, that's not really what I meant. Well, what did you mean? And no, so what I mean is, God has the people who write Genesis cast it into a 7-day account. This allows him to do a lot of theologically important things. I mean, for example, to go through all the divinities worshipped by the Mesopotamians and one by one and say, the sun, God created it. You worship the moon, God created it. You worship animals, God created them. In other words, to demote all of those things, and at the end of the story, he can institute the week, which is important for ordinary secular as well as theological reasons, for the rest that we need, even though he doesn't, and for worship. So, you keep giving me hard questions. Should intelligent life on another planet challenge Catholic social teaching? I don't think so. This is an idea that has long history. A professor of mine at Notre Dame, Michael Crow, wrote a history of the idea of extraterrestrial life. It's come for a couple hundred years, and sometimes it's used by Christians in attack on non-Christian views, sometimes used by non-Christians by attack on Christian views. So I think in general it's, there's a lot of room for thinking about how it's to be done. Surely if they're rational beings, intelligent life, they need to be respected as other rational beings. It's not just because we have a common ancestry that I have to treat you like a person and can't eat you like I would with a cow. It's because you're a rational being. And so a rational being that wasn't related to me, some kind of Martian or something, I don't have the same kind of respect, I think, as a rational being. So at least that start of social teaching. Are we one society with them? I don't know. That's harder to say what the limits are. Do we have to ship stuff up there to, the same as we might have an obligation to help people in Africa or something? Do we have an obligation to help rational beings on Mars? I don't know.
It's this one's about the contradiction.
You show the next to the last slide that has all your statements. Oh, yeah, okay. Where was it? This one, right?
The one that has your point on it.
Stop?
Your point.
Oh, okay. If I go too far, then I have to go back. So, then.
Your solution.
I'm sorry?
Your solution that you had, your proposition.
Oh, I just knew what. Then.
Back. Isn't this your scenario?
Okay, that one? Okay.
The scenario, right? That's what you're offering as a way out of the contradiction.
Phil, can you repeat that for Ken? Maybe Ken's not understanding.
I'm sorry.
This is your scenario.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does that get you out of the contradiction of the
Oh.
you set up P1, 2, 3, 4?
Oh, okay. So what it does is create an original sin created by or performed by the original couple alone and not anybody else. And the guilt for that spreads to their offspring. All of their offspring are get a rational soul. So they're all human beings in the narrow sense, true human beings. And they're all descended from, only if you're descended from Adam and Eve do you get a rational soul. If you're descended from Adam and Eve, you're also get the guilt from original sin. The other ones, whatever cousins, stay immune from rational sin. They can't commit any sins. They're just animals. But you can think if even one parent is sufficient, I'm probably spread by that alone, and surely that'll give some advantage. I mean, in terms of natural selection, so it's imaginable that it'll spread. Yeah.
How important is it?
I mean, I don't hear very well at a distance. Do you have that?
I'm out of order.
Okay, right here. Take another one. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I don't hear very well at a distance. I've got a microphone, but it won't work out there. Could you provide an overview of how the origin of life has been explored by evolutionists, Catholic and otherwise? You think that such an evolutionary leap demands an explanation
Ken, hold on.
involving divine
Could you hear that?
intervention? There have been
Okay.
lots of fragmentary ideas over the past half century or more, maybe 7 years. How long is it since 1950s? Yeah, a long time. I mean, even before that, people were kind of thinking about this. It seems to me nobody has come up with a really solid account of a natural origin of living things on a planet without life. And so, I mean, some people might say, well, science shows, but science hasn't showed. Now, some people might say, but it will show. And you say, why do you think that? And they might say, well, because I think that's the way the world works. Well, I mean, I think that's the way the world works too. So I guess I think also probably life originated by some kind of process we haven't figured out on a non-living world. But that's not because I have scientific evidence. It's because I have a theology of nature that says that God, that's the way God does things. That goes back to those passages from Vossmann and von Hammerstein. I think that's the way God works, but it might not be. I mean, maybe he didn't. Maybe it can't be done that way. So it's possible that God did it directly. Do I think it demands an explanation involving divine intervention? No, because I think there are sometimes things that we can't explain yet, and we should be patient about that. There's a kind of a danger to resorting too quickly to divine intervention. I mean, it's a suggestion that's always available. You can always say, well, this is really difficult. I can't explain this. Must have been God did it. Well, he always could have done it. And if you resort to that too quickly, you end up creating a kind of risk. That is, somebody says to you, you told me that God did this stuff, and then I figured out, that there's a natural way to work it. So how am I supposed to believe about all this other? You're always talking about God. And so, I mean, there's a risk of appealing to divine intervention too quickly, of discrediting the larger and more important project. And really, in the end, it's not so important that what somebody's views about the origin of life are. What's important is their view about the dependence of the world for its very existence on God, and the story of salvation, and so on. Those are the really important ones, and I don't want to put those at risk by resorting too quickly to divine intervention in the solution of a question about the natural history of the world. We got a cards?
Well, I think we're just about there. Folks, let me say that I've never had a conversation with Professor Ken Kemp where I didn't learn something, and tonight is included in that. We will have a reception. There's some cookies, water in the back, and opportunity to speak privately with Professor Kemp or with each other to continue the conversation. But first, would you join me in thanking him for this remarkable lecture?
Well, thanks for organizing this.